As we open this course, perhaps inevitably we have to come back to William Butler Yeats' great poem, The Second Coming, to think about notions of apocalyptic and the world's quote-unquote end as we begin to think about the ends of narrative here. Within Yeats' poem, he says that surely some revelation is at hand, and the sense of resolution in that revelation is one of the poem's central subjects here. To open that, we need to kind of think about what Yeats thought of time and history and how time works. For Yeats, this meant that we were situated within, as what he says in the poem, is the widening gyre. That time passes through these moments of gyre. They're almost kind of cyclone-like as they move through time, that they open and then close in 1,000-year epochs, perhaps, as Yeats imagined them, and that within these times, the gyres marked a distinct sense of shift in how human beings thought of themselves and the world around them. Within the shifts of gyres, though, there were overlapping periods of beginnings and endings that Yeats called antithetical multiform influxes, where you had the endings of one gyre and the beginnings of another. And for Yeats, his own historical moment is, for him, one of those moments of influx, that the old world is coming to an end and some new modern world is emerging. And for Yeats, of course, this is in the historical context between the wars known as World War I and World War II, the time that's situated there. Of course, how we measure those times in between is a little more complicated than that, right? That some historians will argue that World War I, just continued right into World War II, or perhaps that these wars were just part of a continuation of warfare fought from the 19th century on. Here, our own kind of sense of time is important, right? How do we mark or frame time in our own kind of present moments of crisis? Do we think about ourselves in a moment of a Cold War that can suddenly grow hot, or an ecologically balanced planet that is warming? How do those larger narratives affect our own sense of being in the world and being in time? How do we think of a sense of quote-unquote end there? We measure time in abstract means, correct? We define the ends of particular moments. Like with Yeats' gyres, we have our own sense of the end of epochs or millennia. Those of you who remember Y2K, you remember that sense of anticipation that a new millennium was beginning, or the standard measurements of decades at the end of every 10 years, the kind of recollection of what time has passed. Or we think about the naming of generations, the passage from the greatest generation to the baby boomers, to Generation X, to the millennials, to now Generation Z. In what ways do we kind of measure this sense of time? Do we where, in that sense, where do we define the end of the 20th century? Much like Yeats was kind of thinking about the measurement of the gyres and the end of the 19th century. In what ways do we think about the end of the 20th century versus the beginning of the 21st century? In what ways does technology and our own kind of sense of social interaction define the ends of particular moments of time? When Yeats thinks about time, though, in the poem, despite his use of mythical and sacred imagery, and his discussion of mere anarchy being loosed upon the world, right? Yeats is thinking about that in figurative terms, through a system of poetic tropes and a measure of mythical or sacred images. Yeats would say about his writing on apocalyptic, that I had constantly the word terror impressed upon me, and once the old Stoic philosophy of earthquake, fire, and flood at the end of an age, but this I did not take literally. So how do you measure Yeats' sense of apocalyptic imagery here? How do you think about his use of mythic image and sacred figure as the poem develops? How does the poem measure time, or how does the poem reflect on a sense of end here? First, Yeats thinks through sacred or mythical images that emerge, and here are some, here are these, these kind of well-drawn, well-worn mythical images. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, what rough beast is emerging here? So biblical images, images of myth, images of the ancient world that come around again in the poem in a distinctly remeasured or rethought way as Yeats tries to bring them into a sense of new epic or new time. Yeats' historical moment is critical here, right? That there's a sense of decadence and renovation that is present in the world. As Yeats writes in the poem, the darkness drops again. So this is a moment of apocalyptic significance in a way that the time is passing, that we have reached a moment, a nadir kind of a moment where things are just about as bad as they're going to get, and then some new world is going to emerge. And this kind of language about heightened time was endemic in modernism, in Yeats' sense of the modern world emerging. And it appears in all kinds of artistic discourse. It appears in architectural talk. And fiction writers certainly, and poets certainly, had a sense that they were writing in a heightened time of an emergence of a new world in the early 20th century. And so this is the moment where Yeats is speaking from. And for some, as Frank Kermode notes in his great book, The Sense of an Ending, that this is kind of an annunciatory violence that's attendant here, that the wars and rumors of wars that are present in Yeats' world are a kind of an announcement of this new era, that a new world will emerge. For Yeats, art is a means of revelation. It's an albeit consciously false or fictive means of grasping time. And so, even though he's speaking of an end of one world, he's speaking of it in mythical language and using kind of standard, as I say, tropes, poetic images, and also narrative that is known to his readers. So he is kind of inhabiting this kind of fictive means of measuring the world and its passing time. And then kind of a central question to the class is that sense of, how does resolution or end emerge here? In this poem, it's particularly interesting to me to kind of look at the moments of movement and stasis in the poem, right? That sense of being vexed, the 20th centuries being vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, a sense of stasis in being vexed, of being unable to respond against this rocking cradle. So an image of stasis against movement. And the poem's end, the final phrase, to be born, right? That the birth is the ending of one era and the beginning of another. And so the birth here is also a death in a sense, that birth and death are related in the poem, that a new world emerges as an old world dies. So how do we understand this, this sense of fictive time that Yeats engages in the poem? Frank Kermode, on A Sense of Time and Its Ends and Fictions, writes that we are left with eternal transition to perpetual crisis. Crisis is a way of thinking about one's moment and not inherent in the moment itself. The fiction of transition, he writes, is our way of registering the conviction that the end is imminent rather than imminent. It reflects our confidence in ends, our mistrust of the apportioning of history to epics of this and that. Our own epic is the epic of nothing positive, only of transition. we exist in no intelligible relation to the past and no predictable relation to the future. Note here how Kermode's kind of reading of time and in its sense of how Yeats thinks about it in The Second Coming turns that time back into a fictive measure of ourselves. That the fictive time of the poem becomes a space, a narrative space, in which we can think about ends. Those ends are abstracted in a way for the artist. They are arbitrary. They are measured within history, but are also measured within a set of known symbols and stories through which we come to an understanding of the world around us. And this is going to be a central question in the course itself as we read these works. What are the complications to the end here? So when, breaking news is projected on your favorite news channel, what is the narrative impulse of that quote unquote breaking news against, a sense of the novel's news or measurement of time? And in a larger sense, how does one narrate the present crisis, whatever sense of crisis that you feel, that sense of the climate crisis, the crisis of the flight of refugees, the crisis of wars and rumors of wars, what narrative impulse is buried within all that sense of crisis, and how do we narrate that to one another? That'll be a question that we'll come back to again and again in the course as we move forward from Yeats' poem. Thanks.